Don't look that.
Yeah. I mean, technically, I actually.
Well, it's great to have you. Thanks again for being
doing stuff Oh yeah, you really.
I started
Yes. Last year,
away from my workforce. Look around.
No.
Here, I wanted to do something that was.
That's great. Thanks a lot.
At some point, I don't know how I found an email from you.
Right.
And I never answered it. But
Yeah.
You remember. Oh, God.
Yeah, I
I'm
understand.
going to answer this right now because I've had to write 5 papers in
Right.
you had to talk to was your time about
It's like Brad does this.
which I did another talk in Pennsylvania back to back with the Larry because I was going to be there.
For me as well, work in the area.
It was from philosophy.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I don't know. I'm so sorry about that.
It's all right. Sometimes I said, man, it's not many, but you're one of the first. Some people do reply, I just assume not interested.
It's just what happens. I'll get sometimes emails and I delete all the junk ones and then there remaining 5 that I have to reply to. And I'm busy that day and they scroll along and I'm busy the next day.
Look, not for the same reasons, but kind of because sources being and also director of the center, plus I do a bunch of other admins.
Yeah.
So it's overwhelming sometimes. Literally, I'm doing research.
Why is it? One good thing about having
Right.
It made me do my own work for a change.
Right.
When I was at Rutgers, I used to pages a year, and now I'm down to 1 paper. I hope these past few months I had to write these papers, and then if I can find a little bit more time, I can convert them into things. Yeah. I can't find any. But all the papers I've given, I've tried to make this so that they are one to except I really want to reuse some of the material that
I think
the day before yesterday.
Right.
The Chinese, they're going to make a book out of that. Well, we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see about that. Yeah,
Telling them that. But the traction of that book will be just a little essay by me, but then there'll be commentaries by 3.
Okay.
There'll be Francis Cam, Johann Frick, and Joe Lau. And then I write a reply. So there'll be a lot of discussion.
Okay.
And
the new one.
I don't want
what I want. Well, not for a year, maybe 2 terms. We work on value of market.
very good.
But still.
I've heard you use so my understanding. Yes, my understanding.
I was thinking, on McMahan, how the plays was asking me who would
Dan.
to give. But I expect to get a reply if you send an email.
Yeah.
He's almost as bad as I am. And also Shelley never reads anything either, you know, he just thinks about things.
Yeah.
and writes it for us. And I remember when his first book came out, Peter Singer wrote a review. Kagan obviously has very little interest in acknowledging
Yes.
other.
Oh, yeah. That's fine. Yeah. Oh, yeah, because I just want to present it using the best possible form. That's why I'm not interested in the footnotes part and something. But the truth is that
He just doesn't read that.
Okay.
I would read it if I could. I reviewed
Yeah.
on Bartlett, and I was his student.
Yeah, well, yeah.
He could read.
I mean, this one comes like schedule. I just like why.
I like the story out there. He lived in my house when he was
Right.
Rutgers, and one day he came up and said, "How are you doing?" Came up to my study and talked to the house. He was in the basement. I was at that time. I was one of the associate editors of Ethics. Those manuscripts this high that had been submitted to the journal. I had to read this side of the story. And I said, "Well, I said it's going to take me more than 2 full days to read through these manuscripts." And so I said, he said, "Oh, that's." And he was about an hour and a half later. And literally it would take at least 2 days. He came back up and he said, "Okay," and he gave me a thorough kind of summary of each one and explained what was wrong with it, what was good.
How could you do that?
In 9 minutes.
That's beyond me.
Anyway, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe we should get started.
How many people joined? This is hybrid, so we have 40.
Yeah. We have sometimes people coming late, but I'm ready to start whenever.
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Is there a little thing?
I guess
I'll just sit down.
that's fine. If you want to use,
No, if it's okay.
I think you should be able to.
I'll try to speak very loudly.
Okay.
And you can ask the people who are joining online if they can't hear it. Do this.
Good. Would you ask in the chat, Felix? You don't mind. Just when we get started, to ask in the chat if people can hear, just to make sure. Thanks. Okay. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor McMahan. I'm told that that's the British pronunciation as opposed to the less faithful American pronunciation.
Yeah.
White's professor of moral philosophy at Oxford, fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, author of a great number of articles, as well as a number of books, including The Ethics of Killing, Problems at the Margins of Life, Killing in War, and The Ethics of Killing, Self-Defense, War, and Punishment. And today we are going to hear about human extinction and the value of life. Please join me in welcoming Professor McMahan.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I was telling Andrea I was writing this on the plane on the way over here, so don't have very high expectations, please. But I wanted to put something together that would be relevant to the work of the Catastrophic Risk Center. So I chose this title. I talk about human extinction. Just want to make a note of where we started at 4:38. Okay, so some people called antinatalists think that apart from effects on existing people, human extinction would be good. But most people think that human extinction would be bad. The question is, how bad would it be, and what's the explanation of how bad it would be? Now, my own view is that it would be the worst of all the outcomes that are practically possible. I can think of things in principle that would be worse than human extinction, but of all the things that I can think of that might actually occur, extinction would be the worst. And so the question is, how can that view, the view that I hold. Derek Parfit held this view as well. How can this be justified and how can it be explained? Now, there are a lot of partial explanations that I think everybody can agree on. One is that if human extinction were to occur suddenly in some cataclysm, that would involve the premature deaths of everyone alive, and that would clearly be terribly bad for all those people. If extinction were to occur gradually, that would be bad for all the people who would be involved in misery and suffering as the human race was dying out, and particularly bad for the very last remaining people. Either way, whether it occurred suddenly or gradually, there is the fact that, as Sam Scheffler has pointed out in two short but important books, the extinction of the human species would be very much against the interests of all those people who would be alive while the process was occurring, because many of our most important interests are in the contributions, or knowing that we are making contributions to activities and projects and so on that will continue and develop further long after we are dead. So this is particularly true of philosophers. None of us believes that we're solving the problems of philosophy, but what we are doing is contributing to understanding that we expect to go on long after we're dead. So this is true of large-scale moral, political, scientific, and cultural endeavors. Much of the meaning in our lives comes from our sense of being involved in this progress of human understanding and so on, or even just in one's legacy being carried out by one's progeny. So much of the explanation of why extinction would be bad can come from the effect that it would have on existing people, and indeed, in my view, on people in the past who also had interest in contributing to projects that would continue long after they were dead. There is, however, a familiar hypothetical example that suggests that these considerations are insufficient to explain the full badness of human extinction. So suppose that there were a pill that if one were to take this pill, it would cure or prevent all serious diseases, including dementia and including mental conditions like depression. And it would guarantee that anyone who took this pill would have a lifespan and indeed a health span, which means, they'd remain in good health and active and so on for 150 years. Now, so imagine that it would actually be better for every person on the earth to take this pill. But the pill has one bad side effect. It causes irreversible sterility. So anybody who takes this pill could not have children. So imagine everybody in the world wants to take this pill. It'd be good for everybody to take this pill. There are enough pills to go around, and everybody takes the pill. We would be bringing about human extinction. If we think that human extinction in those conditions, namely, what would bring about extinction would be good for all existing people, or better for them than not taking it, then we have to have, if we still think that extinction would be a terribly bad thing in those circumstances, then we can't fully explain the badness of extinction by reference to the effects on existing people. And what that means, I think, is that the full explanation of the badness of extinction has got to refer to those people who could exist and have lives that would be well worth living in the future, but who won't exist if we go extinct. So it seems that there has to be something good in the existence of people with lives that are worth living in the future. And it seems that we have to have some reason or duty to cause or allow these people to exist in the future. That would be the kind of full moral explanation of why extinction would be bad. Problem is, this conflicts with common sense intuition. In the area of philosophy known as population ethics, and this talk is in the area of population ethics, there is a pair of claims that are together often referred to as the asymmetry or the procreation asymmetry, which people writing in population ethics assume is the common sense. It articulates the common sense view about procreation, causing people to exist. So let me tell you what the asymmetry says. It says that while there is a moral reason not to cause a person to exist if that person's life would be bad or miserable or not worth living, there's no moral reason to cause a person to exist just because that person's life would be good or well worth living. There's this deep asymmetry between causing miserable people to exist and causing well-off people to exist. I'm going to call the first of these two claims the claim that there is a reason not to cause miserable people to exist. I'll call that the affirmative claim, because that is affirming something. The second claim that there is no reason to cause a happy person to exist, I'll call that the negative claim. So you'll hear me referring to the negative claim. That's what I'm referring to there. So my suggestion in the talk is that to fully explain the badness of extinction, we have to reject the negative claim of the asymmetry. That is, we have to reject the claim that there's no reason to cause people to exist just because their lives would be good or worth living. And my main aim in the talk is to show that there are various reasons why we should reject the negative claim of the asymmetry. Reasons that are concerned with its doubtful consistency with other common moral beliefs that it would be very difficult for us to give up. But also because it's essential to explaining or giving a full explanation of the badness of extinction. But I'm going to conclude the talk by just summarizing what everybody who works in population ethics is pretty well aware of, and that is if we give up the negative claim, if we reject the negative claim of the asymmetry, we're going to have to face a lot of other problems. Okay, so I'm going to present 4 arguments for rejecting the asymmetry. And as I said, they are all consistency arguments. The claim is the negative claim of the asymmetry is inconsistent with other things that we believe. First argument I want to make is that the negative claim of the asymmetry is actually doubtfully consistent with the affirmative claim of the asymmetry. And that's not terribly surprising. People in population ethics have realized all along that there's a tension between these two claims. And philosophers have spent a lot of effort trying to reconcile these two claims. Wrong to cause a miserable person to exist, but not wrong not to cause a happy person to exist. Reason to not cause a miserable person to exist, but no reason to cause a happy person. But I think we can see more clearly the tension between the two claims of the asymmetry if we ask what the best explanation is of why it's wrong to cause a miserable person to exist. Okay, it can't be because causing a miserable person to exist would be worse for that person. And that's because the term worse is comparative. For an outcome to be worse for a person, there has to be an alternative outcome that would be better for that person. But if we cause a miserable person to exist, generally the only other alternative is for that person never to exist. And there's no one for whom never existing, it could be good or bad. That's not something that happens to people, never existing. There are no people who never exist. So it can't be, the explanation can't be that it's worse for a person to be caused to exist with a miserable life. Now, what a lot of people have claimed in population ethics is the explanation is impersonal, that there are things that are impersonally good or bad that are not good or bad for anybody. Or at least the reason why they're good or bad isn't that it's good or bad for anybody. We can give examples of things that are impersonally good or bad. For example, species diversity. That might be something that is impersonally good, but not necessarily good for any particular individual. But I don't think that the best explanation of why it's wrong to cause a miserable person to exist is that that's impersonally bad. It's not that it makes the world worse. or makes the outcome worse, or diminishes overall value, or something like that, I think the best explanation of why it's wrong to cause a miserable person to exist is that that's bad for the person who exists with a miserable life. So if we cause a miserable person to exist, there is somebody who's miserable, who's suffering, whose life is bad. And it's clearly bad for that person. And so what we've done is bad for that person, though not worse for the person. It's a non-comparatively bad outcome. It inflicts what I'm going to call a non-comparative harm. If I cause a miserable person to exist, I'm harming that person, but not in the usual way of making that person worse off, because that person wasn't off in any way before I caused them to exist. What I'm doing is bringing about a state that is bad for that person, though not worse. So I think that's the explanation. We want the explanation to be centered on the effect on the person, not impersonally, but on that person. And what I suggest is there is a moral reason not to do what would be, in this way, non-comparatively bad for someone. Causing a miserable person to exist would be to cause a non-comparative harm to that person, and a very great non-comparative harm. So now, if this is the correct explanation of the affirmative claim of the asymmetry, then by parity of reasoning, that is the same reasoning, it should be good, though not better, for a person to be caused to exist with a life that is worth living. Good for that person. And there should also be a moral reason to do what is good for people in this non-comparative way. That is, there should be a moral reason to confer a non-comparative benefit on a person by causing that person to exist. So it's exactly the symmetrical kind of explanation with the best explanation of why the affirmative claim is true. Best explanation for why there's a reason not to cause a miserable person to exist. So basically what I'm saying is the best explanation for why the affirmative claim is true implies that the negative claim can't be true. So the asymmetry is internally inconsistent. And I think that the affirmative claim is intuitively by far more compelling than the negative claim. I mean, it'd be very hard to believe that there's nothing wrong with causing a person to exist whose life would be utterly miserable, consist of nothing but agonizing suffering. There's got to be a moral reason not to do that. So that's if the two claims are inconsistent and we have to give up one of them, we should give up the negative claim, not the affirmative. Okay, that's one argument. That's one consistency argument against the negative claim of the asymmetry. It's just inconsistent with the other claim of the asymmetry. Here's a second argument against the affirmative claim. Against the negative claim. So according to the affirmative claim, if what would be bad in a person's life, that is the non-comparative harms, would exceed what would be good in the life, namely the non-comparative benefits, so that the life contains more of what's bad than what's good, therefore is a life that's not worth living, there would be a moral reason not to cause that person to exist. That's an extended statement of the affirmative claim of the asymmetry. And I noticed that when I put it that way, what the affirmative claim presupposes is that there is just a moral reason not to inflict non-comparative harms. That is, not to harm people by causing them to exist. Not to inflict harms on people that are bad for them, but not worse for them. That's the kind of harms that we inflict on people when we cause them to exist. In particular, when we cause a miserable person to exist. So, there is a reason not to inflict non-comparative harms on people by causing them to exist. But what the negative claim says is there's no reason to confer non-comparative benefits on people by causing them to exist with lives that are worth living. But now, it's inevitable that when we cause somebody to exist, that person's life is going to contain some pain, some suffering, some misery. not possible to cause somebody to exist whose life is going to be lacking completely in things that are harmful to that person. But now, since there is a reason not to inflict non-comparative harms, there is a reason not to cause anybody to exist whose life would have non-comparative harms in it. Any life that would contain suffering, pain, misery, whatever, we have a reason not to cause that person to exist. But now, if there's no reason to confer non-comparative benefits, there's no reason to benefit people by causing them to exist. It seems that there's a moral presumption always against causing anybody ever to exist, because it's inevitable that we're going to be causing harms. That counts against it. That's a reason not to do it. It's also very likely, indeed inevitable, that there will be benefits, but we don't have any reason to bring those about. So on balance, the reason not to cause people to exist is unopposed. So we shouldn't cause people to exist. Even people whose lives would be worth living. Now, this is the view that is known as antinatalism. David Benatar, among philosophers, is the sort of preeminent defender of antinatalism. But I'm going to assume that antinatalism is false. I'm going to assume that we all believe that it's permissible for people to have children if their lives would be worth living. If that's true, then we've got to figure out, well, what is it that outweighs the reason not to cause the non-comparative harms? What is it that's doing that work? Well, what the antinatalists say is that if it's permissible to cause people to exist with lives that are worth living, that's just got to be because of the interests of pre-existing people, the kind of interests that I referred to at the beginning of the talk. People desire to have children, strong desires to have children. They want there to be future generations and so on. So basically, the idea here is that if it's permissible to have children, according to the negative claim, that's because selfish reasons override the moral reasons not to cause people to exist. But again, I think most of us don't think of having children as an immoral activity that we can justify only for selfish reasons, only because we really want to do something that's immoral. And it means so much to us to do this immoral thing that makes it permissible. I just don't see how that could be true. So it may seem that the negative claim here implies this presumption against the permissibility of having children. Now, in previous work of mine, I argued that it doesn't actually have this implication, and that's because when we cause somebody to exist, yes, we are causing non-comparative harms. We're doing what makes it inevitable that the people we cause to exist are going to have harms, misery, so on in their lives. But we're also making it that they have good things in their lives. Now, we may not have any reason, moral reason, to cause those good things, but nevertheless, when we cause the people to exist, the good things in the lives compensate those people for the bad things. When the lives are worth living, the good things compensate the people. And what we can say is, while there's no moral reason to bring about those benefits, nevertheless, the benefits offset the badness of the harms, and making it, all things considered, permissible to cause people to exist. So that's an argument I gave. I gave the argument that the benefits in the life have this offsetting function, even if they are not reason-giving. But subsequently, I've come to think that this argument doesn't yield the conclusion that I thought it yielded, which is that it's always permissible to have children with lives that are worth living. So let me explain why I've come to have doubts about this argument that I myself have relied on and published in essays that I've written. The explanation of why I've come to have doubts about this becomes clear if we consider acts that both harm and benefit some existing person. So suppose that for some reason of my own, there's something I really want to do. I want to do this thing. But if I do this thing, it's going to harm some innocent person as a side effect, but it's also going to benefit this innocent person as a side effect, and it's going to benefit this person by more than it's going to harm this person. I am going to be harming this person, be benefiting this person, and the benefits are going to be greater than the harm. Is it permissible for me to go ahead and do this act that I want to do? I think that depends very much on how much greater the benefits are than the harms. And that's because most of us think there is a constraint against harming people. That is, I have a very strong reason not to harm people, only a much weaker reason to benefit people. So if I could confer a benefit on Dan, so I can't seek his consent. I can confer this benefit on him, but the price of that is I'm going to cause him a harm that's precisely the same magnitude as the benefit. So he's not going to be overall better off or worse off. The benefit will cancel out or offset the harm. Is it okay for me to do this act? Clearly not. I can't harm him and then say to him, oh, but look, I gave you a benefit that canceled out the harm. There is this constraint against harming. It's more important not to harm people than it is to benefit people. Our reason not to harm is stronger. If that applies in the case of our treatment of existing people, it should apply to our treatment of people in causing them to exist. So if the negative claim is true, then if it's going to be permissible for us to cause people to exist, the benefits that we confer, the non-comparative benefits that we confer by causing a person to exist, have to be substantially greater than the harms in the life. So it's not good enough to say this would be a life that's worth living. It's got to be a life that's worth living above a certain threshold. In the population ethics literature, there's a name for this kind of view. It's called a critical level view. Now, the argument I'm going to give now derives from a parallel argument that a friend of mine has given against a certain type of critical level view. His friend is named Gustav Arrhenius. He's a Swedish philosopher. So what I've said is, so far if what I've said about there being a constraint against harming is correct, so if I'm going to harm someone and that's going to be permissible because of the benefits I confer, the benefits are going to have to be substantially greater than the harm, then what we have to do is, problem with this comes out when we consider the following example. Again, I'm going to give you a hypothetical example, a fairly simple one. Suppose there's a government official who has to choose between two possible policies. He's got to choose one of these policies. There's no option of not choosing one of these policies. And these are policies that are going to have widespread effects. And as you know, governmental policies can affect how many people are going to exist in the future. Some give incentives for people to have children and so on. So suppose if this government official chooses one policy, that's going to cause a very large number of people to come into existence with lives that are worth living. But the good aspects of the lives are not going to substantially outweigh the bad. These are going to be lives that are good, but not really good. They're going to be just a little bit good. So that's what happens if he implements that policy. If he chooses to implement the other policy, a very much smaller number of people will come into existence, but all of their lives will be miserable, not worth living. Now, according to the view about procreation I've suggested is implied by the negative claim here, that is, we shouldn't cause the harms, but there's no reason to cause the benefits. We have both of these options for this policymaker are bad. He has reason not to do either one of them, but he's got to do one of them. If the number of people whose lives would be worth living, but not by much, is large enough, he ought not to do that but ought instead to cause the much smaller number of people to exist whose lives would be miserable. Gustav calls this the sadistic conclusion, as you cause people to exist who are miserable rather than causing more people to exist whose lives are actually worth living. And that simply can't be true. And so if this isn't true, it's a further reason for rejecting the negative claim. So that's the second argument against the negative claim. Let me go on to the third argument. This third argument is that for a different reason, the rejection of the negative claim does in fact entail antinatalism. That is the view that there's always a moral presumption against causing a person to exist, even if the person's life would be worth living. Or I can't say it that way. It'll become clear in a moment. What I just said was wrong, but it doesn't matter. Okay, remember, according to the affirmative claim, there is a moral reason not to cause a person to exist if that person's life would be miserable. I think it follows from that that there's also a moral reason not to cause a person to exist if there is a risk that that person's life would be miserable. But there's always a risk that any act of having a child or any act of procreation will result in the existence of a person whose life is miserable or will be miserable. And again, this establishes a presumption against the permissibility of having children or procreation. So if procreation or having children is going to be permissible, there's got to be something that weighs against the risk of having a miserable child that makes it permissible. Something has got to outweigh the risk. And of course, if there is a reason to cause people to exist because their lives would be worth living or because there's a very high probability that their lives would be worth living, that could outweigh the risk. That is, if we don't accept the negative claim, we've got an obvious explanation of why it's permissible to have children. In the previous argument I gave against the negative claim, I pointed out that people in whose lives there are inevitably non-comparative harms are usually compensated for those harms by the benefits in their lives. But in this case, in the case of this argument, when somebody is born with a miserable life, there are no compensating benefits in the life. So the solution to the problem I gave a moment ago doesn't apply to this further problem, which is the risk of bringing up people whose lives are on balance bad, not worth living. So it seems to me there are really only two options if we are to believe that procreation is generally permissible, that is, permissible to have children. One is to accept that the only reasons that it can be permissible for us to have children are purely selfish reasons. They have to do with our desire to have children, our desire that there should be future generations, and so on. The other alternative is to accept that it's not true that our only reasons to have children are entirely selfish. That's the only way we can override the presumption against having children because of the risk of having a miserable child. Rather, the negative claim is false. There are reasons to bring people into existence just because their lives would be worth living. And those reasons can weigh against and, in the ordinary case, outweigh the reason not to risk having a miserable child. That's because in most cases, the probability of having a child with a life that's well worth living is very high. And the probability of having a child with a life that's utterly miserable is very low. If there's a reason to bring about the life that's worth living, then we can easily explain the permissibility of procreation. Now, it seems to me, I just want to extend this argument a little bit more. That I think that if we don't accept one or the other of these two options I gave, or both of them, we should conclude with the antinatalists that we actually have a positive moral reason to bring about human extinction, albeit in a humane way, as humanely as we possibly can. and maybe it might help to see this if we imagine another hypothetical example. Suppose it becomes possible for us to populate some distant planet with human beings. And we know for statistical certainty that the vast majority of these people's lives, if we do this, will be well worth living. These will be mostly happy people on this planet, and there'll be lots of them. But there'll be a very small proportion, as is inevitably the case in any human population, of these people on this planet who will have miserable lives. What I think is, unless we reject the negative claim, what we have to suggest is, what we have to accept is, it would be wrong to populate that planet. And if it would be wrong to populate that planet, again, by parity of reasoning, it's probably wrong to continue the existence of the human species for the same reason. Inevitably, in the future, there are going to be people who are miserable. And if that's not outweighed by the existence of people whose lives are well worth living, we can't justify it. We can't justify continuing the human species. So again, I think this, without begging the question about extinction, it still seems to me that, that this third argument I've given provides strong reason for rejecting the negative claim. Fourth argument. Here's my last argument against the negative claim. It's again a consistency argument. What I want to claim is that the negative claim here is in tension with a view that most of us accept. And to elicit this view from you, what I want to do is give you another hypothetical example. Again, easy to follow, so I didn't need a handout for this, I don't think. Suppose there's a couple, two people, who can't have a child by natural conception. They have to have a child through in vitro fertilization and embryo selection and implantation of an embryo created through IVF. They have two embryos that have been created, and these embryos are tested. They are very much the same, except that one of them has a genetic disorder that will cause the child who developed from that embryo to experience periods of bad suffering and to die unusually early. But the life would still be worth living. I mean, it would be a life that's worth living, but with more than usual suffering and an early death. The other embryo doesn't have this condition, so this person wouldn't have that suffering and would live much longer. Now, I think all of us think these are just two possible people. I would say an embryo is not yet one of us. It's just been created. It's just this little multicellular thing. Nobody exists yet. Well, the implantation of the embryo is going to bring somebody into existence eventually. So nobody exists yet. So this is a case, which of these two people are we going to cause to exist? I think everybody agrees that if the parents, for whatever reason, decide to implant the embryo with the genetic disorder, they're doing something they have a moral reason not to do. They ought to implant the healthy embryo, not the embryo with the disorder that will cause suffering and early death. And so there, what we believe is that when there's a choice between causing a better off person to exist and causing a less well-off person to exist, there is a moral reason, in this case and in many other cases, rising to the level of a duty to cause the better off person to exist rather than the different, less well-off person. Okay, so I'm thinking everybody accepts that in a general sort of way. Some people object to it in some cases because the reason for selection would be eugenic in some way, something like that. But let's put all that aside and just focus on this case that I've given of the embryo selection. I think we all agree that it would be wrong to bring into existence the child with the suffering and the shorter life when there is this good alternative, better alternative of bringing a different child. Here's the consistency challenge, and that is, if there's a moral reason to cause a well-off person to exist rather than a different, less well-off person, there should also be a moral reason to cause a well-off person to exist, maybe even the very same well-off person, rather than not cause anyone to exist. But indeed, the idea that there's a reason to cause a better off person to exist only if the alternative is that a less well-off person will come into existence instead. We have a reason to cause this well-off person to exist if what's going to happen if we don't is that some less well-off person, but still well-off person, is going to come into existence. Only then do we have the reason. We don't have the reason at all to bring about the existence of the well-off person if the alternative is that nobody will come into existence. That seems to suggest that causing the less well-off person to exist would be worse than causing no one to exist. And that can't be right. There's nothing wrong with bringing a well-off person into existence just because that person isn't maximally well-off. So what I think is that if there's a moral reason to do what would be good for one person by more, rather than doing what would be good for another person by less, that's the embryo selection case, then there should also be a reason to do what would be good for one person rather than doing what would not be good for anybody at all. And that is to reject the negative claim. Now, some people would respond to this embryo selection case by saying, but there is this reason to cause well-off people to exist, but it's only a conditional reason. We have this reason only when we decide to cause somebody to exist, then we have to choose the best person we can cause to exist, or when it's unavoidable that somebody's going to come into existence, and then we should choose the best one. But I don't know of any good explanation of why this reason should be conditional in this way. Some people have tried to show that it is conditional. My friend Johann Frick suggests that having children is like making promises and then having to keep them or something like that. I don't think that analogy works. I just don't see any reason for thinking that this reason should be conditional in this way. So let me summarize where we've got so far. I've argued that the negative claim is inconsistent with 4 common moral beliefs that are pretty compelling. I won't repeat them, but they're the 4 arguments. So if I'm right about these inconsistencies, it seems that the intuitive costs of continuing to accept the negative claim are prohibitive. We should reject the negative claim, and then as a further reason to reject the negative claim, we've got a good explanation of why human extinction would be bad, even if what would bring about the human extinction would be better for every person in existence at the time. There would still be this terrible cost for all of us taking the happiness pill. So I want to suggest the negative claim is false, and we should instead believe what I'll call the positive claim, which is there is a moral reason to bring into existence a person just because that person's life would be a good one, just because that person's life would be worth living. Okay, so I've now arrived at a view that says it's kind of you might think this is a symmetry view, where there's a reason not to cause a miserable person to exist, and there's a reason to cause a happy person to exist. But I don't think we can accept a perfectly symmetrical view. Here the argument gets a bit complicated, but what I want to do is to state for you what I think are 5 intuitions that we have about the comparative strengths of reasons not to cause people to exist and to cause people to exist, and to confer benefits on people and to harm people. First is many people who accept the asymmetry think that the reason not to cause a miserable person to exist is every bit as strong as the reason not to inflict an equivalent amount of misery on an existing person. So again, I mentioned Johann Frick a moment ago, a German philosopher teaching in the US. He defends the asymmetry. He defends this conditional view about the reason to cause people to exist. He believes that the reason not to cause a miserable person to exist is every bit as strong as the reason not to cause the same amount of misery to an existing person. we could accept that, or we could accept that the reason not to cause a miserable person to exist is a little bit weaker than the reason not to inflict the same amount of misery on an existing person, but it's close. When it's a matter of causing suffering, it doesn't matter much whether the harm is comparative or non-comparative, in my terms. And again, most of us believe in what I call a constraint against harming. So that the reason not to inflict a harm on an existing person is usually significantly stronger than the reason to confer an equivalent or benefit of equivalent magnitude on a person. So again, if I could, I've got to choose either to prevent some terrible harm to Andrea or confer an equivalent benefit on Dan, I should, not confer an equivalent benefit on Dan. I should prevent the harm to Andrea. Yeah. Very welcome. I'm very moral. So there's a moral asymmetry between benefiting and harming, even in the case of existing people. That's a very commonsensical view. But also because there is a constraint against harming, many of us believe that the reason not to inflict a non-comparative harm by causing a miserable person to exist is stronger than the reason to confer an equivalent comparative benefit on an existing person. So again, suppose that one could justify, let me start over here. Suppose that the only way I can save some existing person's life, thereby enabling that person to have all the benefits of continued life, the only way I can save this person's life would be to would involve bringing into existence somebody whose life would consist of just nothing but suffering. If we think that there's this constraint against harming, I shouldn't harm this person by bringing this person into existence with a miserable life as a side effect or as a means of saving a person's life. Even though this is an existing person, the harm that I would be causing to the person who would come into existence is prohibitive. I shouldn't do this. Okay, one final point, and this I think is going to be pretty obvious, and that is that the reason to benefit somebody by causing that person to exist, this would be to confer this non-comparative benefit on this person by causing somebody to exist with a life that's worth living. That reason is much weaker than the reason to confer an equivalent benefit on an existing person. So, I mean, take the obvious case. If I could either cause a really happy person to exist or save the life of some existing person, I should save the life of the existing person rather than cause some new person to exist. And what's more, if I could either save the life of some existing person or cause a better off person to come into existence rather than a less well-off person, I should also save the life of the existing person. So imagine I can do one or the other of two things. I can either save the life of this 60-year-old person, enabling that person to live to 80, or I can intervene and prevent somebody from coming into existence who would live only to be 60, and instead cause a different person to come into existence who would live to be 80. Again, if I can't do both, I think I should save the life of the existing person. Now, what follows from all of these intuitions that I've tried to elicit from you is that if the positive claim is true, that is, if we have a reason to cause people to exist just because they would have lives that are worth living, that's what I've been arguing for, we can't believe that that reason is as strong as the reason not to bring a miserable person. So what I'm arguing is that we should give up what I call the asymmetry, the view that people have wanted to defend in population ethics. We can't accept the symmetry view intuitively. So we should accept what I call a weak asymmetry. There's a strong reason not to cause a miserable person to exist. There is a weaker reason to cause an equivalently well-off person to exist. reason is less strong to cause a well-off person to exist than the reason is not to cause an equivalently badly off person to exist. Okay, where am I? Oh gosh, I need to stop very soon. Or do I? How long have I gone, Dan? Have you guys stopped?
You have gone for, we'll start it at 4:38.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no very strict deadline, so I wouldn't worry too much.
Okay. Well, I was let me try this argument. Let me see if I can speed up though. Okay. One of the problems with giving up the negative claim and accepting the positive claim is justifying the belief that I think most of us have, that in the embryo case that I gave, the parents actually have a duty, and a strong duty, to cause the better off person to exist rather than the less well off person. That's a duty, not just a reason. But it's very hard to believe that we have a duty to cause somebody to exist rather than not cause anybody to exist just because that person would have a really good life. Hard to believe that that's a duty. How can we explain this? How can we? Let me give the game away here. I don't know. This is something I'm still struggling with. This is people in here have done some work in population ethics, Gary, Dan, others. When you work in population ethics, you live in kind of continuous despair because everything you might think is true is going to be false, or there's some desperately bad implication of anything you might believe. Okay, so there doesn't seem to be a duty to cause a person to exist rather than not cause anybody to exist. So how can we justify this? Here's a question. I don't know. Let me give you an example. No, this is a slightly more complicated example, so you have to pay attention to this one, that shows the difficulty of the problem. This is supposed to show how difficult it is. So I want you to imagine there's a doctor, and there are 3 things he can do. Each one of them involves a different woman. I want to say none of these women are his patients. So he's just he can either go here or go there, but none of these people are his patients. He doesn't owe them a professional duty or anything of that sort. And again, I want to stipulate the benefits on the women would all be the same. They would all be equal benefits on the women. So the thing to think about here is what he's doing other than helping these three women. He can only help one of them. So here's the situation. There's a woman who's got. I mean, we can make this another version of the embryo case. The woman who's got these 2 embryos, and one has a genetic disorder, the other one is perfectly healthy. The doctor discovers that unless he goes and intervenes and implants the healthy embryo, what's going to happen is the embryo with the genetic disorder is going to be implanted by mistake. So he can go prevent that. He can go prevent the unhealthy embryo from being implanted and make sure that the healthy embryo is implanted instead. So he can make it the case that this woman has a better off child rather than a less well off child. That's one thing he can do. And that will benefit the woman, but let's put that aside. Second thing he can do is there's a woman who has got only 1 embryo. If this embryo isn't implanted, she can't have a child. It's got to be implanted now. He can go implant that embryo, enabling her to have a child who would be as well off as the better off child of the first woman. But if he doesn't go help her, no child will come into existence. Okay? So this is the case, he can go here, cause a better off person to exist rather than a less well off person. He can go here, cause a better off person to exist rather than no person coming into existence. Third thing he can do is he can go help this other woman in an equally important way, but won't have any effects on anybody coming into existence. It would just be benefiting the woman. So now, if he helps the first woman, he'll be causing a better off person to exist rather than a less well-off person. We discussed this in the embryo case. We agreed that there's a duty to cause the better off person to exist rather than the less well-off person. We already considered that. So if he goes there, he'll be fulfilling a duty. If he goes and helps the second woman to have a child rather than no child, he might be doing what would normally be a duty owed to her, but he's got equal reason to benefit all three women, so that drops out. He's got no duty to cause a well-off person to exist rather than no person. If we're thinking about duties now, we accept the positive claim. He's got a reason, but doesn't rise to the level of duty. He goes and helps the third woman. He's not fulfilling any duty. He's neglecting duty, namely the duty to help the first woman. So what we might think if we just accept the sort of weak positive claim and so on is this: all things considered, he ought to go and help the first woman, where he'll be fulfilling a duty to bring into existence a better off person rather than allowing a less well off person to come into existence. So you've got a duty there, no duty anywhere else, so that's what he ought to do. But now think about what the results are going to be of his three choices, okay? If he goes and helps the first woman, what's going to happen is one well-off child will come into existence. That's all. If he goes and helps the second woman, an equally well-off child will come into existence, and also a second, less well-off, but still well-off child will come into existence. If he goes and helps the third woman, only a less well-off child will come into existence. So we got these three outcomes, which is it seems really strange to think he's got a duty to go produce an outcome in which one well-off child exists rather than produce another outcome in which an equally well-off child comes into existence and another well-off child who's just less well-off. That seems crazy. So it looks like the implication is we've actually got a duty to cause a well-off child to exist rather than not cause anyone to exist. Sorry. I can't bring myself to believe that, but that's where the arguments are pushing me. So that's counterintuitive, but in theory, it makes good sense. That's because the reason to cause a better off person to exist rather than a less well-off person is that one will be doing more good to the better off person by conferring a greater benefit than one would be doing good by the less well-off person who would be conferring a lesser benefit. But if the reason is to confer the greater benefit on the person, then there's that reason to confer that great benefit should be there even when the alternative is that no one would come into it. In fact, it should be stronger. Doing some good rather than less good, or doing the same amount of good rather than no good. Okay, where are we? I started at 38. I should stop. I was going to go off onto the repugnant conclusion and then a view that might help with that, but I'm going to stop. I'll just say one thing, and that is, if we reject the negative claim and accept the positive claim, that is, we accept that there is a reason to cause a well-off person to exist just because that person's life would be well worth living. We've got a good explanation now of why extinction would be bad, but it's not a perfect explanation. It's not perfect because it doesn't explain why it's important to us that all these good lives should be lived farther and farther into the future rather than all simultaneously. So imagine that we could, I don't know how to set this up, but imagine we could have this indefinitely large number of people all existing at the same time, and then everything goes extinct, or we have the same number of people existing over millions of years. Surely it's better over the millions of years. How do we explain that? Again, I think probably the best explanation is the intuitive one, and that is that if it goes over time, there's going to be progress. And the explanations that Scheffler gives are going to be realized in the expanding the number of lives over time rather than simultaneously. If it's over time, people's moral, political, scientific, cultural projects will continue to develop. There will be progress in all these different domains. And that's important to us now, and we might think it's also impersonally better. You know, the course of events is just impersonally better if there's progress than if there's just a lot of happy lives lived all at the same time. You know, maybe another part of the explanation is that if we continue to progress and if we have genetic enhancement and so on, people's lives in the future will have much higher levels of well-being than any lives that have been lived so far. Okay, so I'll just stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I'm going to sit over here so I can keep track of people online in case they have any questions. But I'll start out with people in the room. So please raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll give you numbers and then call on people in order of numbers. Adam is 1, Ralph's 2.
Waiting for all the decisive objections. Since I'm not actually defending these.
Yeah, Adam, why don't you start?
Great. We have a small question that makes sense and a big question that doesn't. Which one do you want to use?
Why don't I try both? We've got plenty of time.
I'll start with the big question. Maybe it doesn't make sense. Yeah. So the intuition at the end about like the distribution of people in time seems very compelling. But yeah, extremely difficult to make sense of, especially because it seems like, I mean, maybe we're stretching the bounds of thought here, but it seems like you can imagine people living concurrently and also imagine the sort of sorts of valuable experiences that people have in like thinking about, you know, how great their progeny's lives will be or whatever. We replace it with something equally valuable, and yet it still seems like we have the intuition that it's not as good. It's hard to think about, but yeah. And I guess maybe it seems like what's going on there is you start to suspect that our view about the like value of humanity existing into the future is just like a prejudice, or just doesn't really have any rational grounding, that it's like grounded in some sort of like picture thinking where like humanity existing into the future, like humanity's like a human life, or like humanity's like a story, and like it's bad for the story to end, or it's bad for a human life to end, but it's not like better for a story to have like more words in it, or it's not like better for like a person to get bigger. And like obviously that doesn't make any sense at a certain level, or I mean, well, those claims make sense, but like when you apply that schema to all of human civilization, it's not clear that it makes sense. And so I guess at some level I worry that that's kind of what's going on. Like we clearly have very concrete interests in humanity existing. Like I'm not saying that those don't exist, but I just wonder whether they actually explain sort of the robustness of our intuitions about the value of humanity existing. Because it seems like if they did, you'd be able to confound them, you'd be able to explain them away, or you'd be able to like counterbalance them or whatever in the sort of way that is happening in this thought experiment. But it just seems impossible to do that. And that makes it seem like whatever we're thinking when we're like thinking about the real value of like humanity existing, it probably doesn't make a ton of sense. That's my thought.
Okay. Can I deal with the question that doesn't make any sense before the one that does?
Well, that was the
one that doesn't make any sense. But yeah.
I won't ask you.
No, you can. I'm happy to have the other one. I don't know whether you want to let somebody else go before you come back to the one that does make sense. But I think that one makes perfect sense, and I'm really grateful to you for bringing it up, because it kind of makes me think that maybe the best explanation is just some purely consequentialist one, that the more good there is. But again, that's still not going to do it, is it? I like the suggestion of the kind of narrative explanation, that you think of the career of humanity over time being like a human life, and a lot of people have produced these narrative explanations of well-being or narrative explanations of the self, and an overall good life is one that follows some sort of narrative progression and achieves a kind of completion. But of course, in this case, we don't want the history of the human species to achieve completion. We want it just to keep going on and on and on. I think that, you know, there are people who accept one of these kind of narrative explanations, you know, maybe even Scheffler, I don't know. You know, once we've solved all the problems of philosophy and figured out the full truth about physics and chemistry and everything, you know, then it's time for it to end. And I know an example of this. I think this is a fact that almost nobody knows, but it was a fact that was, well, I take it as a fact because it was told to me by Derek Parfit, who got it from the source. Source was John Rawls, and Rawls said to Parfit that once human beings achieve a fully just society, it's totally unimportant that human life should continue. That once we've achieved full justice, that's it. There's no point in anything after that. And I find that extraordinary and incomprehensible. But Rawls was not a moron, to put it mildly. You know, Rawls was brilliant. So there are some people who have this view. There's some ultimate aim to it all, and it's not, you know, it's not theological.
Yeah, it's very Hegelian.
I guess I don't know quite enough about Hegel to be sure about that, but I'll take your word for it.
Okay, maybe we can come back to you. So Raf's next.
Yeah, in the beginning when you were discussing the first argument, you were developing a symmetry in terms of, and you mentioned explicitly what is good for or bad for a person, right? It's personalized, right? And I wondered later on in your discussion whether you were still understanding a life worth living in these personalized terms, in terms of what's good or bad for a person.
Yeah.
Being miserable or suffering, or versus being well off, something like that. I was wondering if you would understand the life worth living in less personalized terms, not strictly in these personalized terms, where it becomes easier to understand why you may have the duty, for example, also to exist to have a life worth living. If it is understood in a broader sense, what that may involve a life worth living. I mean, and then the conclusion, the symmetry, may not be so surprising. I wonder, I mean, in say in a traditional morality, it seems people often thought there is a duty to of offspring to continue, say, the family or the people, or even just humankind or some religious reasons. Then they are, of course, not thinking of these personal benefits, like what might be benefiting this particular person's brought into existence, but might benefit family, people. Yeah, then it doesn't become so surprising. At least this is what people seem to have thought traditionally.
Yeah.
For population ethics.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Again, I think that's an extraordinarily helpful thought. It's not one that I'm going to be attracted to, but I think you're right that it may very well have explanatory value with respect to a lot of other people's beliefs. It's a very common kind of thought that there is somehow not necessarily the values of individual lives that matter, it's the value of some kind of collective. And this is going to be, I guess, an impersonal kind of value. That is, we don't want to explain the importance of the continuation of the culture, the group, the community, the collective, or whatever, just in terms of the fact that will be good for the individuals. There's something of impersonal value in the continuation of the group itself. And the group could be just human species. So this is going to be the impersonal explanation, and the reason to cause well-off people to exist is going to be derivative. This is the instrumental way of continuing the group. So just to take an example that's on my mind these days, because I have many friends who are philosophers in Israel, and I've been arguing that the invasion of Gaza is wrong, and they've been very angry at me. Some of them agree with me, most of them disagree with me, and they're very angry about it, and they think the threat from Hamas, from Hezbollah, from Iran, and so on, these are the Nazis again. People want to exterminate the Jews. So you take the Jews as a paradigm case. You know, this is the people who are dispersed all over the world, no state for century after century, but really determined to maintain the group and the identity, the culture, the religion. That, you know, the Jews have to survive. The Jews have, you know, eventually have to flourish, and so on. It's nothing to do with individuals. It's the group. And I can see some sense in that. I mean, I don't myself, I'm not attracted to this kind of view, because I think it's precisely because people form themselves into these groups that we have all these wars. You know, they're the Palestinians and the Jews and the Iranians and and it's because the people have these identities that they're always wanting to kill each other because they don't like the people who are different from them. So this is an explanation that's not, but this is very important in sort of legal terms, because if you think mass murder is one terrible thing, but genocide is regarded as much worse. And that's, you needn't kill more people in genocide. You can kill more people in a non-genocide, fewer people in a genocide, but most people will think the genocide is worse. Why? Because it's the obliteration of the group, the collective. So I agree, it's a very common thought, and it probably is very much part of the full explanation of why many people think that extinction would be bad. In a way, I like this idea better, because the group is the whole human species, not just, the Russians or the Americans or the Palestinians or whoever. It's everybody, all of us. Leaves out animals, but still, it's much more inclusive than all the national identities and so on. Very long response, because I was trying to think my way through it, but that's very helpful. Thank you.
James is next.
Yeah, so I just have a related question about non-comparative benefits. So the way you describe it, that's, I guess that's something we don't see none, right? But the harm is comparative. Right?
Well, I'm claiming that it's not necessary.
Right, sure. But then the idea strikes me just, it sounds a lot like impersonal good to me. Like it sounds like a nicer way of packaging impersonal good. And I totally get the intuition of, yeah, it sounds much better to say, oh, what really matters is bad for the person. But, the utilitarian or whatever can also say, yeah, you're right. The suffering is bad, but we add that up, right? And that you get many of the same results as the utilitarian, and you are adding it up in similar ways. So I guess I'm just wondering if there's some sort of deeper distinction here that you could point me toward in terms of the difference between non-comparative benefits and impersonal
Sure. Well, if it's impersonal, they're not really benefits, they're just goods or values. And that's part of it. Let me the idea of non-comparative benefits and harms was an idea that I had, but it came out in Parfit's Reasons and Persons in the distinction between what Parfit calls narrow individual affecting reasons and or narrow person affecting reasons and wide person affecting reasons. Are you familiar with that? And so in Reasons and Persons, Derek distinguishes three types of reasons. Narrow person affecting reasons are reasons concerned with well-being, they're concerned with what's better or worse for people or individuals, including animals. Wide individual, you can have wide individual affecting reasons, or wide person affecting reasons, which are reasons to do what would be good for people and not to do what would be bad for people, only if we accept this concept of non-comparative benefits and non-comparative harms. So the distinctions are there in Reasons and Persons. In Reasons and Persons, Derek made the primary contrast that between what he called a person affecting view, which was a narrow person affecting view, and an impersonal view. And he thought the correct theory of population ethics, the big theory that applies in what he called different number cases, theory X, he called it, he didn't know what it was. The correct all-encompassing theory was going to be an impersonal theory. It's going to have only impersonal reasons. And so he just kind of ignored what he called wide person affecting reasons. But in the last paper he published in Philosophy and Public Affairs, it was published posthumously, so after he died, in that paper, and in some stuff he had been doing before that, he had come to believe that a more plausible way of articulating the views that he thought were best in population ethics about cases involving different numbers and so on should take what he called a wide person affecting form rather than an impersonal form. And I think the reason for that was exactly the kind of intuition that I was appealing for. When we want to know what's bad about causing a miserable person to exist, it's the miserable person, not just this impersonal badness. It doesn't matter whether it's good or bad for anybody. I mean, what Derek thought and what I tried to indicate and what I believe is we do need to distinguish between outcomes that are bad because they are bad for individuals and outcomes that are bad because they are only impersonally bad. So give you what I think is a really good example of a reduction in something that's impersonally bad would be a reduction in inequality that's not better for anybody and is actually worse for people. So this is a view that my former colleague at Rutgers, Larry Timken, had. He said there would be a reason to reduce inequality because inequality is bad, even if the only way to do that was to make some of the better off people worse off. So you just make some people worse off and you don't make anybody better off. You've reduced inequality, but you've made people worse off and nobody better off. It's anti-Pareto. And Parfit thought, at first at least anyway, that was absurd. And he called this the leveling down objection to that kind of egalitarianism, this impersonal egalitarianism. And I agree with Larry on this. If you reduce the inequality, you have diminished something that is bad, but in a way that's worse for people and not good for anybody. But something bad has been diminished, namely inequality. Now, what that means, what Larry conceded was the reason to reduce inequality in this impersonal way is always outweighed by the reason not to do what's worse for people. But nevertheless, there would be one good thing happening. If you made the better off people less well off, you would be reducing this objectionable inequality among people that's nobody's fault. It's not the fault of the worse off people that they're worse off. So that's an example of a genuinely impersonal bad thing or impersonal good thing. Also species, diversity, and things like that. these are things that are neither good nor bad, better nor worse for anybody, but the state of affairs is just better or worse. We can, I mean, anyway, that's the view that I have, and that's why I think why Parfit in the end came to think that when we're concerned, when we're concerned with problems that have to do with well-being or welfare or whatever, a wide person affecting view is going to be better characterization of what we think is really good or bad than a purely impersonal one.
That's very good. That's very helpful.
Anyone I should add to the queue? Okay, I'm going to slightly, maybe it's a slight abuse of my position, but put myself into the queue, and I just wanted to ask, it seemed like you were very unfriendly to views on which the parents' sort of selfish reasons for having children play a large role in the considerations that make it permissible to have children. And I guess I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit on that, because I guess I'm thinking, yeah, it sounds sort of bad to say when we say that you did something for selfish reasons, but having selfish reasons can obviously make things morally permissible. Like if I come across a piece of chocolate cake and it's going to be really good for me to eat it, but it's going to like annoy some people in the room a little bit, I could very easily think, well, the benefits to me are significant enough that there would be nothing morally laudable about me refraining from eating this because the people in the room don't have a claim to really be annoyed because they should appreciate how great the benefits are to me. I'm not saying the situation with having children is exactly analogous, but yeah, it does seem like wanting to be a parent is among the most important and significant projects that people have. And to me, at least, my other views about procreation, things like that, but to me, at least, it seems, given the significance of this project and how important it is to people, it would be kind of surprising if it didn't play a pretty important role in explaining the morality of procreation. But it seemed like you were less friendly to that. So I was just wondering if you could say a little more about why.
Yeah. Thanks. I think I hadn't realized until you said that I am actually rather skeptical about whether the parents' desires can override the moral objection. Because you're making me realize that if the appeal to the interests of the parents and whatever, if we confine it just to the interests of the parents, the form of justification morally might have to take, if it's a really moral justification, is what Sam Scheffler called an agent-centered prerogative, or an agent-relative permission. I'm entitled to give greater weight to my interests than and somehow my interests can override what would otherwise be moral constraints. And you can see the implications of this kind of view in some of the literature about self-defense. There are some people who said, the first person who developed this view was Ann Davis in a paper in Philosophy and Public Affairs back in the early 80s or late 70s or something about abortion. She said, we have this right of self-defense that entitles us to cause harm to innocent people if necessary, because we can give greater weight to our own interests than to the interests of others. And the view was developed, say, theoretically by Sam Scheffler and others. And then some people have argued in the self-defense literature that, for example, it can be if I'm about to be killed by a wrongful attacker, but the only way I can save myself from this murderer will involve killing an innocent bystander as a side effect. So to save myself, I have to kill an innocent person. that's okay. That's permissible because I'm entitled to give greater weight to my interest than to the interest of this innocent person. So this is an implication of the agent relative permission view. And I can't bring myself to believe that. I think it would, because there's a constraint against harming, I believe that it would be wrong for me to save my life from a murderer if doing so would kill an innocent person as a side effect. That's not permissible for me to give priority to my own life over the life of the innocent person, if what I'm doing is killing that person. Now, I do think it's permissible for me to give some priority to my own interests or my own life where there's no constraint, no deontological constraint involved. So I'm permitted to save my life rather than sacrifice my life to save the lives of 2 other people. That seems to me plausible. But killing somebody is different. And I think maybe the same thing applies with causing non-comparative harms or take a risk of causing a miserable person to exist. Do my interests really give me a permission to do this when there's going to be an innocent victim? I don't think the appeal to there may be some plausibility to the idea that the parents' interests, have some weight and all, have some role in the justification. But it seems to me that if the objection to having a child is, I'm going to be inflicting harms on somebody that are not compensated for by the benefits, or I'm going to be risking causing a miserable person to exist, do my interests justify me in doing that? I think that's not going to be the full explanation.
That's helpful. Thanks. Come back to Adam's sensible question, or
Well, now I feel out. Yeah. So I guess this question is just about. I mean, it's very basic. I wasn't sure I fully understood the magic pill, actually. Like, so maybe this isn't that important in the dialectic of the paper, but just like, everybody chooses to take the pill, and like, is it kind of an experience machine thing where the pill makes them happy, or it just makes them not have senescence, or until they're healthy till they're 150? Then, well, but then that's
not. I thought about this. I thought about it being not an experience machine, but I thought about. By the way, I said this is a familiar example. Somewhere in the literature, there's an example like this. So this is I can't claim credit for this example, but I was kind of making it up for the purposes of the talk today, and I thought about putting in something like it would have effects like a good antidepressant would have, but it would do even more than that. It would make you kind of a Marcus Aurelius type stoic. You would always be able to cope with fortitude with misfortune, and you would see all the good things in your life. You would have a very positive outlook. So it could, but it wouldn't be an experience machine.
But just so the purpose of the thought experiment is to say, well, because people would choose to take the pill, we couldn't, in that scenario, then explain the badness of human extinction in terms of something that was bad for those people.
Well, it's not that they choose. It is that I want to say it is objectively better for them, even though they realize there won't be future generations. People won't be continuing to write philosophy. There won't be any more good artwork. All of this will be over. But even where people's objective interests are concerned, it's better for people to live an additional 70 years of good life than to have these prospects for people in the future. So,
okay, good. I guess that was then my question, which is like, I couldn't help but thinking of the movie Children of Men, because like, are you familiar with Children of Men? Well, it
I don't watch movies.
It motivated the Scheffler book. It's like this. It's a
Which one of them?
Death in the Absolute.
Oh, really? Okay. I read that.
Taken from a book. I think Shepard mentions the book.
Yeah.
PDJ.
Okay. Yeah, I vaguely remember there was a reference to a P.D. James novel.
It's a fictional scenario where people can't procreate anymore, and it descends into a sort of totalitarian regime. And I guess I was thinking that something similar might happen in this type of scenario, where like in the thought experiment, we're holding constant, like we're just going around living our lives, but people's incentives would immediately, if everybody knew everyone took the pill. Now, like, I'm not going to save for retirement anymore, because or well, what you get the idea. I'm not going to save for posterity, certainly. So now, now we're not saving for posterity. So now, like, all the hedge funds go under, but now the economy collapses, and now we're all,
Okay.
and a week later we're living in the streets. And now it wasn't such a good idea taking those pills.
Well, see, this is one of the real advantages of being a philosopher, and that is you can just make things up and stipulate them. So I hereby stipulate that none of this would happen,
Okay.
and that people would go on making food, but they'd be very happy doing this, and they would go on doing whatever is necessary to make material life good and so on. But
if it happens, they will still be.
Yeah, this is great. I love the war of all against all. Yeah.
yeah, it's not clear where there would be the war of all against all, but who knows? Maybe we'd still have to have police officers, but they'd be very happy police officers. Live a long time. And by when the police officers were all elderly, so would all the criminals be elderly. Evened out.
All right, well, we're a little over. We started a little over as well, but I think we should end it here. Please join me in thanking our speaker.
Well, thank you all. Those were really all extremely helpful questions. Thanks. Eventually, I'm going to publish something like this, and it will be better for this discussion. Seriously better. Thank you.